had seen her under fire, seen how she didn't flinch, how her commands weren't theory but survival. One younger soldier muttered, "She saved Peterson's life today," and no one argued. Hale kept quiet, though inside his thoughts wrestled. He couldn't deny the facts. The ambush had been real and she had spotted it before any of them. Yet pride weighed heavy. To admit she had earned the victory was to admit his vow had been broken. He sat apart from the others, staring into the flames, telling himself it was luck, coincidence, nothing more. But deep down he knew luck didn't carry men through firefights with such precision. Luck didn't calm a unit like that. Leadership did. Over the following weeks, the missions grew harder, and Rowan's influence spread like wildfire through the ranks. She drilled them relentlessly, not with cruelty but with purpose. Every maneuver had meaning, every order tied to survival. She listened too, not just commanding but asking for input, weaving Hale's battlefield instincts into her strategies without dismissing his experience. That, more than anything, unnerved him. She wasn't there to outshine him. She was there to use every tool available, and he was a tool she valued whether he liked it or not. For the men, this balance became undeniable. They found themselves looking to her for direction, but they still leaned on Hale for steadiness. Together, though unspoken, they were building something stronger than either alone. Hale resisted the thought, but he couldn't resist the results. The real turning point came on a storm-lashed night when orders sent them into the heart of contested territory. Their objective: sabotage an enemy supply depot buried deep behind the lines. The rain hammered the earth, turning ground into mud, soaking uniforms until they clung heavy to every step. Lightning split the sky, illuminating twisted ruins and shattered trees. Hale trudged through the mire, his rifle slick in his hands, and thought again that this was suicide. But Rowan was at the front, her silhouette cutting through the storm like a banner. Her voice carried low and steady, coordinating movements even as thunder roared. When the depot came into sight, a cluster of makeshift warehouses guarded by patrols, Hale expected hesitation. Instead, Rowan laid out the plan in terse, precise sentences, assigning roles with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed it 100 times in her head. The assault was swift and brutal. Explosives planted, guards dispatched, the depot lit up in a storm of fire that rivaled the thunder above. But when enemy reinforcements arrived faster than expected, the unit was nearly overrun. Hale found himself back-to-back with Rowan, their rifles spitting fire into the dark, mud splashing up as bullets tore the ground around them. For a moment, it felt like the old days, except the figure covering his flank was not one of his battle-worn men but the woman he had sworn would never command him. She didn't falter, didn't shout for retreat. Instead she growled through clenched teeth, "Hold the line. We're not dying here." And somehow they didn't. The men rallied, the charges detonated, and the depot went up in a roaring blaze that lit the night sky like a second dawn. When they finally fell back into the jungle, soaked, exhausted, but alive, Hale realized the truth he had been running from. She wasn't just proving herself. She was proving them all wrong. The weeks after the depot raid changed everything. The men no longer muttered doubts when Rowan entered a room. Instead, they sat straighter, boots aligned, rifles cleaned, eyes sharper. She had become a force they could not deny, and even those who once sneered at her presence now watched her with something close to reverence. Hale, though, remained a wall of stone, his pride and anchor dragging heavy against the tide. He carried the weight of his earlier words like shackles. "No woman will command my unit." Every time he saw her issuing orders, every time he caught the flicker of respect in a soldier's eyes, he felt those shackles tighten. Yet in the silence of his thoughts, he began to wonder whether he was clinging to pride or to fear, the fear that his authority, built through years of blood and sacrifice, could be eclipsed not by another man but by her. One night, while the unit rested in the ruins of a village long abandoned, Hale sat on a collapsed wall sharpening his knife. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp with the smell of wet stone and charred wood. Rowan approached quietly, not in command but in conversation. "Your men follow you with loyalty I've rarely seen," she said, her voice calm, almost respectful. Hale didn't look up. "They're my men," he replied flatly. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable in the dim firelight. "They're ours now," she said softly. The words cut sharper than any blade. Hale's hand paused on the knife, his jaw tightening. He wanted to snap at her, to remind her of the vow he'd sworn, but the weight of their recent victories silenced him. He had seen men follow her into fire without hesitation, had seen her bleed for them without complaint. The truth was undeniable no matter how much it burned. She had earned her place whether he liked it or not. The next mission tested that fragile acceptance. Orders came for them to secure a communications outpost that had been broadcasting enemy signals across the front. It was a fortress of steel and concrete, bristling with defenses, and every other attempt to take it had ended in disaster. Hale thought command had finally gone mad, sending them on what looked like a suicide run, but Rowan met the challenge without flinching. "We'll do it," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that steadied even the most doubtful. She laid out a plan as if she had been studying the outpost for months, using terrain, weather, and timing with a precision that left no room for chance. Hale found himself drawn into the strategy despite himself, offering adjustments, corrections, ideas. To his surprise, she not only listened but incorporated them seamlessly, as though she trusted his instincts as much as her own. For the first time he felt not undermined but valued. The assault began under cover of darkness, the moon hidden behind clouds. Rowan led the vanguard, Hale at her side. The men spread in silent formation across the hills. They slipped past patrols like shadows, every step a test of discipline. When the first gunfire cracked, it was already too late for the defenders. The units swarmed the outpost with deadly precision, cutting through resistance room by room. Hale fought like he always had, but this time his eyes kept searching for her in the chaos. He saw her clearing a stairwell, dragging a wounded soldier out of the line of fire, barking commands with steady clarity. She was everywhere at once, tireless, unstoppable. When the final tower fell silent, the communications array in flames, Hale stood panting on the rooftop, smoke stinging his eyes, and realized something he had refused to admit until now. She wasn't just his commander. She was his equal. In the days that followed, the victory echoed through the ranks. Other units whispered of the outpost's fall, of the woman who had led the charge where so many had failed. Her name was beginning to spread beyond their circle, whispered with respect across the front lines. Hale heard the rumors and felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because she had done the impossible and he had stood beside her to see it. Dread because he knew what came next. Command would not stop with outposts or depots. They would give her larger battles, bigger responsibilities, and soon she would rise beyond him. The thought twisted inside him like a knife. For years he had been the center of his men's loyalty, the unshakable core. Now he feared becoming a shadow to her light. One evening as the men cleaned their weapons, Rowan approached Hale again. This time there was no softness in her tone. "They trust us," she said, "but they'll only survive if we trust each other." Hale stared at her, searching her eyes for arrogance, for manipulation, for anything he could use to dismiss her. But all he saw was conviction. Reluctantly he nodded once, a gesture small but monumental. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, only inclined her head in acknowledgement. In that moment, a fragile alliance was forged, not spoken but understood. Hale still clung to his pride, still carried the echo of his vow, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the war would not be won by one of them alone. Perhaps it would be won together. The fragile alliance between Hale and Rowan was tested sooner than either expected. Intelligence reported that the enemy had massed an armored column pushing toward their sector, a strike force powerful enough to smash through defenses and sever supply lines for miles. Command, desperate and stretched thin, gave the order to intercept. Hale stared at the map, the red arrows cutting like wounds across their territory, and knew the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. His first instinct was to argue, to call it madness, but when he looked at Rowan, she was already studying the terrain with eyes sharp as knives. "We can't meet them head-on," she said firmly. "But we don't have to. They're strong, yes, but strength can be turned into weakness if it's channeled into the wrong ground." Her voice carried no hesitation, only resolve. Hale felt the men watching her, felt the shift in the air as soldiers leaned in, listening not with skepticism but with trust. Against his will he leaned in too. Rowan laid out her plan with surgical precision. The enemy's tanks would funnel through a valley, its sides steep and narrow, leaving them exposed if their line was broken. She intended to lure them into that valley, collapse the ridges with explosives, and trap the column in a choke point where the tank size would work against them. Hale, though still reluctant, saw the brilliance in it. He offered refinements, suggesting where ambush teams could position themselves, where fallback points should be marked, and she accepted each with a curt nod. For the first time, their voices blended not in opposition but in unison, their strategies weaving into something neither could have built alone. The men, watching this rare harmony, felt a surge of confidence they hadn't known they needed. The night before the battle, silence cloaked the camp. Men cleaned weapons in the glow of dim lanterns, their movements deliberate, their faces tight with the knowledge of what awaited them. Hale sat by the fire, his knife idle in his hands. Rowan approached, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. She didn't sit, only stood with her arms folded. "Tomorrow will be the hardest test yet," she said quietly. "Some of them won't come back." Hale met her eyes, saw the weight she carried, the same weight he had shouldered countless times. For the first time he realized she bore it alone, without complaint, without relief. Against his instincts he found himself saying, "Then we make damn sure most of them do." She gave the smallest of nods, and for a moment, they stood as equals, two soldiers bound by the burden of command. When dawn came, the valley lay shrouded in mist, the air heavy with anticipation. Rowan's orders were crisp and measured, every man moving into position with the precision of a blade sliding into its sheath. Hale led a squad to the ridgeline, setting charges in the rock, while others positioned anti-armor weapons along hidden paths. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant rumble of engines. Then, like thunder rolling through the earth, the tanks arrived. Their iron hulks emerged from the fog, massive beasts grinding forward, their cannons scanning for targets. The men held their breath, every muscle taut, waiting for Rowan's signal. She crouched near the front lines, binoculars raised, her face carved from stone. At the perfect moment, her hands sliced through the air. The first explosion rocked the valley, a roar that sent boulders crashing down the slopes. Dust and fire swallowed the lead tanks, grinding the column to a halt. Gunfire erupted from the ridges, rockets streaking down into steel hulls, flames blooming like twisted flowers. The enemy scrambled, their formation shattered, their strength turned into chaos. Hale barked orders, his voice steady, his rifle spitting fire as soldiers poured lead into the trapped convoy. Rowan moved with them, her presence unshaken, rallying faltering men, dragging the wounded to cover, always where the danger was sharpest. Hale saw her silhouetted against the smoke, fearless, relentless, and for the first time, he felt not just respect but a surge of something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was more than a commander. She was the reason they might live through this hell. The battle raged for hours, steel against fire, will against will. When the last tank finally burned, its cannon sagging into molten wreckage, the valley fell silent except for the crackle of flames and the ragged breaths of survivors. The cost had been heavy, men lay broken among the rocks, but the column was destroyed, the advance halted. As medics worked, the soldiers gathered around Rowan, their eyes filled with gratitude and awe. Hale stood apart, sweat and grime streaking his face, watching her accept their silent thanks without arrogance. She spoke no grand words, only ordered them to tend to the wounded and prepare for the next fight. That humility, that refusal to bask in glory, struck Hale harder than the explosions had. He had known many commanders who sought medals, recognition, applause. She sought only survival, and that made her more dangerous than all of them. That night, when the fires dimmed and the survivors sat in weary silence, Hale found himself walking toward her. She was cleaning her rifle, her movements steady despite the blood drying on her sleeve. For a long moment he said nothing, the words caught in his throat. At last he managed, "You saved them today." She didn't look up, only replied, "We saved them." Hale stared at her, his chest tight with unspoken conflict. The vow he had made echoed in his mind like a ghost, but the evidence of his eyes crushed it beneath reality. She had commanded his unit. And for the first time he realized that perhaps it was not betrayal to accept it. Perhaps it was salvation. The destruction of the armored column became a turning point not just for Rowan's unit but for the entire war effort in their sector. Reports spread quickly, painting her as the architect of the impossible victory. Higher command sent commendations, but she brushed them aside, redirecting every ounce of attention back to preparing for what came next. For Rowan, the valley was not a triumph to be celebrated but a brief reprieve bought with blood. Hale noticed how she never lingered near the wounded, not because she lacked compassion but because the weight of their eyes threatened to break her focus. She carried her grief in silence, burying it beneath discipline. He recognized the habit, it was one he had perfected over years of combat. Yet seeing it in her struck him differently. He realized she was not untouched by loss, she simply refused to let it paralyze her. In the weeks that followed, command began leaning heavily on their unit, tasking them with operations that seemed too vital, too risky, and often too costly. Each time, Rowan accepted without hesitation, her voice steady, her planning meticulous. Hale found himself falling into rhythm beside her, no longer clashing but anticipating her thoughts, finishing her sentences and strategy sessions, leading squads in perfect coordination with her broader tactics. The men noticed the shift, the old tension that had once divided them was gone. They saw Rowan and Hale not as rivals but as a pair of pillars holding up the unit. Loyalty, once fractured, now fused into something unbreakable. Still, Hale carried a quiet storm inside him. He had built his entire life around being the center of command, the figure his men looked to without question. Now, when their eyes turned to Rowan first, he felt both pride and loss. Pride that she had earned it. Loss that he no longer stood alone at the front. One mission in particular carved this realization deeper. Their orders were to intercept enemy forces attempting to retake the communications lines that Rowan's unit had severed. The battlefield was a stretch of open plain dotted with ruined farmhouses, a killing field where cover was scarce and every movement visible. Rowan devised a daring maneuver, splitting the unit into 3 flanking groups, using speed and deception rather than brute force. Hale had doubts, but by now his trust in her was instinctive. When the battle began, chaos erupted across the plain. Gunfire shredded the fields, explosions tore craters in the soil, and smoke coiled into the sky. Hale led one flank, his men surging forward in bursts, taking cover behind broken walls. Across the plain, he saw Rowan moving with the other flank, her figure cutting through the storm, her rifle flashing, her shouts carrying even over the roar of combat. At one critical moment, the enemy nearly broke through their center. Hale's heart clenched as he saw Rowan sprint into the gap, rallying scattered soldiers, her presence like a lightning rod. She didn't order them to hold, she led by example, standing firm as bullets snapped past her head. Hale charged forward with his men, meeting her in the gap, their combined forces slamming into the enemy like a hammer. The tide turned, the enemy line shattered, and the plain was theirs. The cost was heavy, but the victory undeniable. When it was over, Hale caught her eye across the smoke and rubble. Neither spoke, but the look they shared carried more than words. Mutual recognition, mutual reliance. After the battle, when the unit licked its wounds in the shelter of a half-collapsed barn, Hale found himself sitting beside her for the first time without hesitation. She was bandaging a cut on her arm, the cloth already stained dark with blood. "You're reckless," he said, his tone flat but not without something resembling concern. She gave a faint smile, weary but genuine. "So are you," she replied. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the noise of the men around them fading. Hale wanted to tell her everything. The vow he had made, the pride that had blinded him, the grudging respect that had grown into something more. But the words stuck. He had no practice at speaking what lay in his chest. All he could manage was, "You're not what I expected." Rowan glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then returned to her bandage. "Neither are you." The war ground on, each day a blur of mud, fire, and exhaustion, but the unit moved with newfound purpose. The men no longer doubted survival because they no longer doubted their leaders. Rowan's strategies and Hale's instincts meshed so seamlessly that soldiers began to joke they shared the same mind. Yet under the surface, Hale felt a shift he couldn't ignore. He had started this journey with defiance, vowing never to follow a woman's command. Now, not only was he following, he was thriving under it. His pride still resisted, but the resistance grew weaker with every battle, every victory, every moment when her presence meant the difference between life and death. He began to realize that perhaps leadership was not about who commanded but about who earned the right to. And she had earned it 100 times over. One evening, while the men slept, Hale stood watch at the edge of camp. The night was cold, the stars scattered like shattered glass across the sky. Rowan approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the dirt. She didn't speak at first, simply stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. After a while she said, "The war is shifting. We'll be asked to do more. Maybe more than we can give." Hale tightened his grip on his rifle, staring into the dark. "Then we give what we can," he replied. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not just command but a flicker of trust, of something human beneath the steel. For the first time, Hale felt the shackles of his vow begin to crack. He didn't say it aloud, but inside he admitted the truth. She commanded not just his unit anymore. She commanded him. The war escalated with a ferocity neither Hale nor Rowan had anticipated. Rumors spread that the enemy was preparing one last decisive offensive, a push meant to break the stalemate and crush their forces entirely. Command summoned Rowan and Hale to headquarters, where maps littered the tables like scars across the earth. Generals spoke in clipped, weary tones, outlining the threat. A massive army advancing toward the capital, armored divisions supported by waves of infantry. If the capital fell, the war was lost. Rowan studied the maps with a calm intensity, her finger tracing potential choke points, supply routes, weaknesses. Hale stood beside her, arms crossed, his eyes sharp, absorbing every detail. When the briefing ended, silence lingered before Rowan spoke. "Give us the vanguard," she said. The generals exchanged doubtful glances, but there was no mockery, no dismissal. Her reputation had grown beyond question. Finally they agreed. Hale watched her step into responsibility with a steadiness he once thought impossible, and he realized the war was no longer just about survival. It was about victory. Preparation consumed the days that followed. Rowan drilled the unit harder than ever, refining maneuvers until every soldier moved like part of a single machine. Hale took the lead on logistics, ensuring supplies, weapons, and ammunition were ready. Together, they forged an army that was no longer just his unit but the spearhead of the resistance. The men, once divided, now carried themselves with fierce unity, their loyalty unshakable. Hale noticed how Rowan balanced strength with humanity. She pushed them to their limits but also knew when to let them breathe, when to share a word of encouragement, when to let silence speak for her. That balance was what made the men follow her into hell without hesitation. And Hale, though still haunted by the vow he had made, found himself not just following but believing in her vision. The day of battle arrived under a sky bruised with storm clouds. The air thrummed with tension, the ground shaking under the approach of enemy armor. Hale stood with his men, rifle slung across his chest, watching Rowan move through the ranks. She didn't give speeches, she didn't need to. Her presence alone steadied trembling hands and hardened uncertain eyes. When she reached Hale, she paused. For a moment, their eyes locked and no words were necessary. They both knew the cost that awaited. They both knew that this fight would define everything. She gave the smallest nod and Hale returned it. Then the thunder of war began. The enemy came in waves, a flood of steel and fire rolling across the fields. Rowan's voice cut through the chaos, commanding movements with precision. Hale's instincts filled the gaps, rallying men, plugging holes in the line, charging into fire when courage faltered. Together they were everywhere at once, Rowan directing the storm, Hale holding its heart steady. Explosions tore the earth, machine guns rattled, smoke turned the sky black. At one point an enemy breakthrough nearly split their line, and Hale threw himself into the breach, rallying men who had begun to waver. When he glanced back, Rowan was already there beside him, firing into the oncoming wave, her face streaked with soot, her voice a rallying cry. The line held. Hours blurred into eternity. The battlefield became a nightmare of fire and screams, but Rowan never faltered. She moved like a force of nature, unrelenting, her commands turning chaos into order. Hale felt himself drawn into her rhythm, fighting not just for survival but for the vision she carried. He no longer thought of her as a commander forced upon him, no longer weighed his pride against her authority. In the furnace of battle, he saw her as what she truly was. The leader they needed, the one who could turn despair into defiance and defiance into victory. The vow he had once clung to seemed laughable now, a shadow burned away by firelight. As the day wore on, the enemy's momentum began to falter. Their waves grew weaker, their armor fewer. Rowan seized the moment, rallying the men for one final push. "Forward!" she shouted, her voice cutting through smoke and thunder. Hale echoed her cry, his voice carrying like a second command, and together they surged. The charge broke the enemy's spirit. Soldiers scattered, tanks burned, and the field that had been a graveyard of hope turned into a beacon of triumph. When the last shot faded, silence fell heavy, broken only by the ragged breaths of survivors. They had held. Against all odds they had held. That night, as the men celebrated with weary relief, Hale sat apart, staring into the flames. Rowan approached, dirt and blood streaking her face, her uniform torn but her eyes still burning with that same relentless resolve. She lowered herself beside him, silent for a while. Finally Hale spoke, his voice rough. "I was wrong." She turned to him, her brow furrowing slightly. He swallowed hard. "When they said you'd lead us, I swore it would never happen. I swore no woman would command my unit." The words tasted bitter, but releasing them felt like lifting a stone from his chest. Rowan's expression softened, not with triumph but with quiet understanding. "It was never about you or me," she said. "It was about them. About winning." Hale nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. For the first time he felt the weight of his vow crumble completely, replaced not by defeat but by something far stronger, respect. As dawn broke the next day, the battlefield lay quiet, smoke drifting like ghosts across the horizon. Reinforcements had arrived, securing the ground they had bled for. Rowan stood before the men, her posture steady despite exhaustion. Command would promote her soon, Hale knew, She had risen beyond their small unit, beyond any single battle. Watching her, Hale felt no resentment. Instead he felt a strange, unexpected pride. He had fought beside her, doubted her, hated her, and finally followed her. And because of that, they had won. The victory at the capital was not the end, only the beginning of the final chapter. Though Rowan's unit had shattered the enemy's offensive, the war machine was not yet broken. Reports flowed in of enemy forces regrouping at the border, gathering for what would be their last desperate stand. Command wasted no time. Rowan was promoted officially to general, the youngest in the nation's history, her name spoken with reverence across the ranks. Soldiers who had once doubted her now carried her image as a symbol of endurance. Hale stood among them, no longer the skeptic, no longer the man clutching a vow of pride. He was her second, her shield, and though he wore no new insignia, his men followed him as faithfully as they followed her. Together they prepared for the war's final act. The march toward the border was grueling. Supplies ran thin, and the landscape bore the scars of endless conflict. Villages reduced to ash, roads cratered by shells, rivers choked with debris. Yet morale held firm. Rowan's presence seemed to banish despair wherever it appeared. At night she walked among the men, speaking to them quietly, reminding them of home, of what they fought for. Hale often watched her from the shadows, marveling at how her strength didn't come from unyielding hardness but from a resilience that bent without breaking. He found himself thinking less of the vow that had once defined him and more of the strange bond that had grown between them, forged in fire and tested in blood. He knew he would follow her into any battle, even into death. At the border, they faced a fortress that loomed like a beast carved from stone and steel. The enemy had entrenched themselves, determined to make this ground their final hold. Artillery batteries lined the ridges, machine gun nests dotted the walls, and miles of trenches cut through the earth. It was a death trap and everyone knew it. Some whispered it could not be taken, that the cost would be too great. Rowan silenced those doubts with one unshakable declaration. If we do not take it, the war never ends. We finish this here. Her words spread like wildfire, steadying hearts and stiffening spines. Hale felt them pierce him as well, and he knew she was right. There could be no half measures. This would be the battle to decide the fate of everything. The assault began at dawn under a pale red sky. Artillery thundered first, shaking the earth and tearing craters into the fortress's outer defenses. Then the infantry advanced, rows of soldiers surging across open fields under a hail of bullets. Rowan was at the front, refusing to command from the safety of the rear. Hale stayed close, cutting down enemies that dared to rise from the trenches, dragging wounded men to cover when chaos threatened to overwhelm them. The fight was brutal. For every yard gained, bodies fell. Smoke turned day into night, and screams mingled with the roar of guns. Yet Rowan's commands never wavered. Her voice guided them through the storm, a steady hand in madness. Hours bled together into carnage. By midday they had seized the first line of trenches, but the fortress still loomed ahead. Hale's uniform was soaked with mud and blood, his rifle hot in his hands, but he pushed on. Rowan moved like a force of will, rallying soldiers again and again, her determination unbreakable. When an enemy shell collapsed part of their advance route, trapping dozens, she led a charge straight through machine gun fire to carve a path. Hale followed without hesitation, his body driven by instinct, his loyalty to her absolute. The men, inspired by their example, pressed forward with renewed fury. Slowly, painfully they carved closer to the fortress walls. By nightfall they reached the gates. What remained of their unit was bloodied and battered, but they had come farther than anyone believed possible. Rowan stood before the gates, eyes blazing in the firelight. "One more push," she said, her voice carrying through exhaustion and despair. Hale looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment he saw not just a commander but something greater, the embodiment of every soldier's hope, the reason they still stood when reason said they should have fallen. He gripped his rifle tighter, nodded once, and shouted to the men. "With her. With General Rowan." The cry echoed, and the final charge began. The battle for the gates was savage. Blades clashed, rifles fired at point-blank range, men wrestled in the dirt for survival. Hale fought like a man possessed, never letting Rowan out of his sight. She cut through the enemy with ruthless precision, each movement purposeful, each strike a declaration that this war would end. Together they reached the massive iron doors, their men surrounding them. Explosives were placed, the gates shattered, and the army surged inside. The fortress became a tomb of chaos, corridors and courtyards erupting in violence. Still, Rowan pressed on, her determination dragging them through the heart of darkness. Hale stayed beside her, every step, every shot, every breath bound to hers. When the final stronghold fell, silence swept the battlefield. Smoke drifted through shattered halls, and the last echoes of gunfire faded into nothing. Rowan stood at the center of the fortress, her sword lowered, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Around her, soldiers dropped to their knees, some weeping, some laughing, all overwhelmed by the realization, it was over. The enemy was broken. The war, after years of endless bloodshed, was won. Hale stood at her side, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his body aching with wounds, but his spirit alight with something he hadn't felt in years, peace. Rowan turned to him, her eyes shining with a fire that had carried them this far. "It's finished," she whispered. Hale nodded slowly, unable to find words. He thought back to the man he had been, the one who swore no woman would ever command him, and felt a bitter smile tug at his lips. How foolish that vow seemed now, when the woman before him had not only commanded him but had led them all to victory. In that moment Hale understood. The war had been won not just by strategy or strength but by belief, and Rowan had given them that belief. She had risen beyond every doubt, beyond every wall, and carved her name into history. Peace did not arrive in silence. It came with a roar of celebration that swept through the nation. The news of Rowan's victory at the border fortress traveled faster than any messenger could run. Bells tolled in cities, flags unfurled in villages, and strangers embraced in the streets. For the first time in years, children could laugh without fear of sirens, and families could sit beneath their roofs without the dread of bombardment. Rowan's name was carried on every tongue. General Rowan, the woman who won the war. Soldiers toasted her in their camps, politicians praised her in their halls, and poets began weaving her deeds into the fabric of legend. But for Rowan herself, the triumph was quieter. She stood atop the ruined fortress where the last battle had ended, staring into the horizon, knowing that the hardest part was not the war itself but what came after. Hale found her there, silent and brooding as the smoke cleared. He limped from his wounds, his uniform torn, his body worn thin, yet his eyes carried a light that mirrored hers. "You should be resting," he said, though his tone carried no reproach. Rowan shook her head. "Rest comes later. For now there is rebuilding. A war does not end with a battle, it ends when people can live without fear." Hale studied her for a long moment, recognizing the weight she bore. She was no longer merely a commander of soldiers, she had become a guardian of a future that was fragile and uncertain. And though she had risen to glory, she carried it without arrogance. That, more than victory itself, humbled him. In the weeks that followed, Rowan and Hale led their men not in destruction but in restoration. Roads were repaired, villages rebuilt, and survivors aided. Where once soldiers carried rifles, now they carried tools and supplies. Hale watched with quiet admiration as Rowan moved among civilians with the same calm presence she had shown in war. To the old, she offered respect. To the young, reassurance. To the grieving, comfort. She had not shed her steel, but she had tempered it with compassion. Men who had once followed her into fire now followed her into the work of peace, proving that leadership was not forged solely on battlefields but in every act of service. Yet peace brought its own battles. The old council of generals, many of whom had once scoffed at her rise, now struggled to accept her dominance. Some sought to claim credit for her victories, others to diminish her role, whispering that the war had been won by circumstance rather than her hand. Rowan faced them with the same unwavering resolve she had shown in combat. "It was not I alone who won," she told them, "but every soldier who believed, every family who endured, and every voice that refused to yield to despair. If you would erase that, then you erase the people themselves." Her words struck like steel, silencing dissent, for none could deny that the soldiers worshipped her as their own. Hale, ever by her side, saw the shifting tides of politics with a veteran's suspicion. "Victory breeds envy as much as gratitude," he warned her one night as they walked the rebuilt streets of the capital. Rowan's lips curved into a weary smile. "Then let them envy. What matters is that our people sleep without fear." Hale nodded, though in his heart he knew her path would never again be free of conflict. She had become more than a general, she was a symbol, and symbols were both revered and resented. Still, he vowed silently that whatever storms rose, he would stand with her as he had in war. Time moved and the nation healed. Soldiers returned to farms and workshops, families reunited, and children grew up knowing peace as more than a distant dream. Statues were raised in Rowan's honor, though she disdained them, calling them unnecessary. But when she passed through the towns, the people gathered, cheering and reaching out to touch her hand. She had become more than history, she was hope incarnate. Hale often walked behind her, unseen by many, content in his role. He no longer thought of himself as the man who once declared that no woman would ever command him. That vow seemed like a relic of another life, belonging to a soldier blinded by pride. Now he knew better. He had not been diminished by following Rowan, he had been remade. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon gold, Hale approached Rowan with a question that had lingered unspoken for months. Do you ever think of what might have been, had you not chosen this path? Had you remained a soldier among soldiers without command? Rowan turned to him, her gaze steady. I was never meant to remain in the shadows. The war demanded more of me and I gave it. But if you ask whether I regret it, the answer is no. Not because of glory but because it gave me people like you. Allies. Friends. A family I never expected. Hale felt a rare ache in his chest, a warmth he had not known since before the war began. Then I have no regrets either, he said softly. Years later, when songs were sung of the war and children recited tales of Rowan the general, Hale's name was often left to the margins. Yet those who had served knew the truth, that he had been the steel beside her flame, the voice beside her command, the man who surrendered his pride to follow a leader worthy of it. And in the quiet moments, when Rowan herself was asked how she had borne the impossible, she would simply smile and answer, because I never walked alone. Thus the story of Rowan did not end with war, but with peace hard-won and fiercely guarded. She proved that greatness was not bound by gender, that strength was not measured by arrogance, and that the truest leaders rose not by demanding loyalty but by inspiring it. She had once been dismissed, doubted, even scorned. Yet in the end she had risen to general, carried her people through fire, and built a future out of ashes. And the man who once swore that no woman would ever command him lived the rest of his life knowing that following her had been the greatest honor he had ever received. The end.